Now, the U.S. President Donald Trump is expected to outline his ideas for a top-down tax reform of the United States tax code. It's one of the cornerstones, in fact, of his entire campaign. Amid administrative chaos and apparent policy failures of his presidency, he has continued, however, to stress the continued importance and need of tax reform. Now, the idea of changing the deeply complicated U.S. tax system for both companies and individuals has been bandied about for at least a decade now, but the last substantial change was 30 years ago. U.S. companies currently have to pay a corporation tax of about 35%. That's higher than most parts of the world, including relative to OECD economies. But economists say that changing the U.S. tax code will be a very steep uphill task for the president. Now, there's a lot to get into as far as proposed changes to the U.S. tax code are concerned. Let's bring in Daniel Ranges in Washington, D.C. He's going to be a navigator in these treacherous waters. Daniel, given how badly the process of repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act went, is it even possible to get tax reform done before the 2018 midterms?
Ask yourself what the Republicans and Donald Trump is trying to achieve here. What they want is a reduction in corporate taxes and some personal taxes, and they also want not to increase the deficit. So how do you get that done? Well, you could look at tax loopholes. There are many in the United States. For example, when you pay your mortgage, you get tax relief from that. Okay, so throw that out the window. But what about the real estate industry? They'll be lobbying hard. That's just one example of the sort of challenges that are there. Okay, you say, well, if you can't get many tax loopholes, nonetheless, when you lower corporate tax rates, you increase economic growth. And so in the end, it pays for itself. Well, most economists worth their salt would say, actually, that's not the case. And a lot of the time, corporations do not end up investing in new production, new capacity, new jobs with their tax cuts. And that's what creates the kind of economic growth boost over the long term that you really need. And that this is only ultimately going to be a kind of corporate sugar high for shareholders, passed on to shareholders through dividends and through buybacks and that kind of thing. So there are some real deep problems. And I haven't even brought in the Democrats. They need to bring along the Democrats in some form if they are going to do deep tax reform. Otherwise, it's going to be slightly on the edges, slightly superficial. So yes, there is a very uphill battle to go. And what you need to be able to do this is leadership and vision and bringing the country along. You need a great salesman. You need Republicans and Democrats working together. None of that is in place at the moment.
Indeed. So back in April and May, the broad outlines of this plan essentially included cutting the top corporate tax rate from 35%, bring that down to about 20%, and then cap personal income taxes at a maximum of 35%. But how will those two changes affect the U.S. tax base, at least over the next decade, assuming, and we're making a major assumption here, assuming they are implemented?
Well, here's the thing, that if you are looking at the U.S. tax system, you cannot look at anything in isolation. So, for example, if you cut corporate taxes, but you don't cut personal taxes enough, what people will do is these sole proprietors will turn themselves into corporations and thus avoid tax. If you have systems to try to repatriate cash, as I think we're going to talk about, then you need something to offset the incentive for them to continue doing the same thing. So it's possible to increase the tax base. But again, in order to do that, you need a huge amount of political capital, because ultimately there always are going to be winners and losers. And so as things currently stand, that political capital is not there. And therefore, what you will end up with is either no tax reform or a tax reform that is unsustainable.
Indeed, which is precisely the sort of conundrum that the Republicans are facing right now. But let's talk about American multinationals, Apple, Amazon, the lot. They have hundreds of billions of dollars stashed offshore in a sort of fiscal no man's land. The terms like Dutch sandwich and a double Irish come to mind now. Does this plan open a gateway for the repatriation of that money into the U.S., at least perhaps with a one-off tax or some other measure in place?
Well, yes, it potentially does. And what that would do is it would bring in, I mean, the current figure is astonishing. They reckon that these US corporations are sort of hiving off about 2.6 trillion US dollars. So if you brought that money back in with some really good incentives, for example, you know, you pay 5 or 10% tax on that and you bring it back in, for the first year or two, you're going to get a sugar high off that. You're going to get increased economic growth as, you know, they feel more free to spend money in the economy and press the go button on some of their investment projects, perhaps some new manufacturing, perhaps bringing some of the industry back into the United States, who knows? But the problem is this. If you do that, then you create a new incentive for corporations to again go and stash their cash somewhere else. Essentially, it's a form of tax avoidance, and you reward these corporations for that kind of behavior. That's why it's very important to try to get the right level of tax so that you don't create those incentives down the line. And also, once you've brought that money into the country, you want to be able to use that money productively to expand the US economy. But as I said earlier, what tends to happen, and what happened in 2004 with the George W. Bush repatriation holiday, is that corporations simply chose to give the money back to their shareholders, and that does not create new capacity in the US economy.